Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. We have a case of the giggles today, and so I'll just let Molly continue to laugh over there. But if you want to see any pictures or videos from what we talk about today, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, so I'll get that out now. Okay, you feeling better, Molly? Ready to join us?
I'm ready to join.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about and also I'll just say, we did record that like 40 times before right now when I just decided we're going to just push through it.
But last time I decided I was going to push through it and you were laughing, and then how come I didn't get to use that take?
Well, because you went on for too long. Anyway, so moving on, I'll just edit that part out. I'm just kidding. I don't like to edit. So today we're going to talk about our time hiking from Klapatche Park to Pyramid Creek. So it did rain hard that night at Klapatche Park, but luckily about 4:30 a.m. it stopped. So then everything was actually dry by the time we got out of our tent, and we felt like we had just mastered the art of letting your tent dry out versus getting rained on all night, because it was like, yes, I feel like the rain would like come down hard, and then like stop for a while and then come down hard. But we didn't have to listen to the incessant like drip, drip, poppity, pop, pop, pop thing that was happening the night before. So honestly, that felt like kind of a hack.
And it was interesting to me because it was weird when it would rain. The rain would only go for 10 to 30 seconds and then it would stop again. And so it was just this blustery night with like very intermittent rain. And then you guys can tell us your opinion, but I really think that it's actually louder to listen to rain drip from a tree than to listen to rain fall from the sky. And I don't understand why that is.
Yeah, I'm not really sure the physics behind that, but just intuitively, I say you're correct. So it was a beautiful morning. The mountain was 100% out. It was sunny. It was a little bit chilly, but honestly, like, it just felt so exciting because the day before had been sunny and nice, but this day was like sunny and a little bit warm and nice. So we even were able to bring our breakfast down and sit on this log in front of the lake where we could just watch the mountain and see its reflection.
And when I first got out of the tent, before I even got out of the tent, I opened it up just to see if the mountain was out, because I was really just kind of like a little bit sad. I thought it would be socked in, and I was like, this is one of the most desirable campsites on the entire trail, and we were able to get it, and it would be a little bit of a bummer if we couldn't even see the mountain. And I peeked out the tent, and it was like Carrie said, just 100% there, visible, and a really stunning angle of the mountain as well. Carrie and I, we've seen Mount Rainier, obviously looking at it from the north side quite a bit, just because we've done a lot in, I don't know, like that I-90 corridor and the Glacier Peak Wilderness and everything. So when you look at Mount Rainier, you see the north side. But we'd never looked at it from this specific angle, and it was just really epic how the glaciers are flowing from the top of the mountain. I think there's the Puyallup and the Tahoma glaciers. And so when we went down to have our breakfast, did we see the ranger already down there?
No, we didn't see them until quite like about the time that we were going to leave. But I think the funny thing about us is like anyone that we see hiking, well, if they know the area, like there was a man down there when we had breakfast and we were like, do you know which glaciers these are? And he was like, no, I do not. I'm like, maybe I should stop just asking people. But if they know, it's really fun. But another thing beyond just the glaciers, like the glaciers were beautiful. And because it was in season, you're seeing a lot more of like actually the glacier versus like the snowy layers on top. So you're seeing all these crevasses, and you can almost see some of the like really beautiful blues, and I think that was just stunning to see. And then the rocks of a volcano, especially the volcanoes of the Pacific Northwest, they can have like these purple and like deep red hues to them, and so it's just like a stunning picture altogether, plus the little bit of fall colors that we were getting at Klapatche Park. It was cool talking to the ranger though. Before we were gonna leave, the ranger was down there at the same time that we were down there. She even took some photos for our little friends photo shoot. She was so cool about it. But it was cool because she kind of told us which glaciers she thought that they were. And then she discussed with us that actually the height of Mount Rainier has technically changed. I think that USGS is probably gonna have to do a survey, but there was someone who independently surveys the peaks, and he was able to discover that due to some melting of the glacier, Columbia Crest is no longer the summit, correct? And and now there's a different spot that's a summit. So we were kind of talking about how she's been joking with her friends that they've never actually summited Mount Rainier because it's gotten shorter over the course of the last like 30 or 40 years since the last USGS survey.
And that means that the ice that was at one point the summit has melted to the point that now there's a rocky area that is the true summit at this point, the highest point. So the mountain won't get any shorter now, but it's just an interesting thing. And so kind of cool because Carrie and I had actually been following that on our own, and then the ranger mentioned it, and we all could just be a little bit nerdy about geology for a minute.
And to be a little bit nerdy about geology for a minute right now, it was actually kind of interesting because apparently there were 3 ice cap mountain like summits in the lower 48. One's El Dorado Peak, which is a peak that we had planned to climb earlier but didn't and hope to climb someday still. And I can't remember the other one, but Mount Rainier was the 3rd true ice cap summit, and now it's no longer one of those. So it's just kind of some interesting details. She also pointed out to us this area called the Sunrise Amphitheater, which was an area for where we were standing, it was sort of to our right near the summit. And it's like this area where she was talking about how you can see all the different lava flows like exposed just based on the way that the rock was laid down. So I feel like Mount Rainier was such a treat because like geologically it's just like so rich and you actually get to see all those features.
And one of my friends had joked at one point about some other people who were hiking around Mount Rainier and basically saying like, well, like, do we want to see the mountain for a week on our left side or our right side? And I've never like, you think like, oh, is looking at the same mountain just gonna get kind of old? But with every peak I've circumnavigated, mountains are so different as you move around them that I've not been bored of it yet.
And as she was leaving, the ranger did mention that they were starting to pull some of the bridges because it was getting a little closer to winter. So that made me slightly nervous because I was like, what bridges? So she had said that they were going to pull a bridge from Frying Pan Creek. And honestly, this made me nervous up until the point we crossed it because I don't know why, but I feel like sometimes when something unexpected happens, it can just be one of those things that we like hook on to and we're like, that's going to be something that's actually scary or sketchy. But honestly, when we got there, it was just like a little foot log had been removed and we did actually a dry foot rock hopping. So that was kind of awesome. So after that, the ranger and our group parted and went our separate ways. And first she did review river crossings with us, which was super nice of her. And it was kind of cool because everything that she told us about river crossings was exactly the way that we've given you guys information about river crossings, facing upstream, kind of stepping to the side. There's a good video on our Instagram that demonstrates this, and maybe I'll have to post an updated one. Unclipping your hip belts, unclipping your chest belts, and, keeping 3 points of contact if possible at all times. And so it was nice because I just feel like they obviously have more updated information because they're rangers and that's what we've been doing in practice and that's what we've been telling people to do. So it was nice to kind of have that confirmation.
And I had also then shown a picture of like the blueberry that I took a picture of the day before to the ranger, and then she said that her fellow ranger was actually maybe more versed on that, and she was like, yeah, I was just reviewing our vegetation sheet before I went out today. And that's when she said that the thing that we'd been seeing was blueberry, and I was like, oh man, I was bummed that I hadn't tried it because I hadn't eaten it because I didn't know if it was okay to eat. And then that's when the rangers had told us that there are no poisonous berries in Mount Rainier National Park, which once again we're going to have to look up because that blows my mind. Like, I can't really believe that that's true, but that's what they told us. So there you go.
So for some reason we went up again, which I thought that as soon as we left Klapatche, because we'd done all that ascent, I thought like, okay, now an immediate downhill. But there was this like little additional ridge that you had to go over before you got to go down. And I will say that area was really pretty as well. I mean, honestly, it's just so pretty on this trail. And again, with the fall colors, it was just out of this world. But so we went over the ridge and then we headed down to this beautiful lake that's called St. Andrew's Lake. And one thing that's kind of funny about the Wonderland Trail is they tell you there's no dry campsites, but technically some of their campsites have like such minimal water sources or are far, or they'll be like a quarter mile away from water sources. So it was a great trail to have far out up on as well, because we were able to see which campsites we need to carry water with us to. And so Klapatche was one of those sites where we had carried some extra water there, and then we didn't have very much water left over in the morning, so we filled up right at the St. Andrews Lake, which was so picturesque and stunning. And of course, Molly and Rachel had to have a little rock skipping competition, which was then very funny because Rachel allegedly, according to her, skipped a rock like 5 times, but both Molly and I had turned the other way. We were putting on our packs, and we never would have known, except for there was a girl who was descending who was like, "That was unbelievable the way you just skipped that rock." And so it was kind of funny because Rachel at least had someone to back her up on that.
And I thought, so there is a pond at Klapatche Park, but it was, there wasn't a ton of water in it when we stayed there, so it would not really have been a very suitable water source. And it was good to see that St. Andrews Lake, even though this was the end of September, still had a lot of water in it and was a suitable source for us. So that was really nice. And then just being able to see Mount Rainier reflected in the lake was so beautiful. It was a little bit of a disappointment because we were only maybe 3/4 of a mile from our camp. So we couldn't stop and take like an extended rest break really. But I would have loved to spend like even an hour there. Probably would have been a nice time. And so it was just so warm. There were no clouds in the sky. The sun was shining. It was one of those just perfect bluebird days, and I was just really enjoying it. And just grateful once again to be out there. And so this was going to be a 13.5-mile day for us, which is a very suitable day for backpacking. But I was actually a little nervous on how it would go because we'd only done an 11 and an 8-mile day before that. I was like, oh man, now we're going to finally do a longer day with more up and down. And I wonder how it'll go. But like all backpacking trips, you take it one step at a time and you continue on. So we then started a longer descent after St. Andrews Lake. And I feel like this day was a challenging day because I think we went up 3 times and down 3 times. So we've talked in the past about sometimes when you get in like your downhill gear, your uphill gear, it just feels good to walk like that for a while. But we had to keep switching gears. But in a way, the climbs were steep enough that it kind of felt good to switch it up, even if that meant from going downhill to going uphill. I really don't think we did much level walking this day, but we walked down until we got to the Puyallup River, and it's interesting because that glacier splits into a north and south, we'll call it like a branch, and then the rivers flow from that. So we'd crossed the north the day before, and now we're crossing the south on a bridge, and then we were heading up to an area called Emerald Ridge. And the hikers that we had seen at St. Andrews Lake had mentioned that they were sure it was going to be a really beautiful area, but it was socked in at the time, so they didn't get to actually see any of it.
Emerald Ridge was such a cool area because first of all, it's all this beautiful green grass ahead of you and on the ridge. And then, of course, there's this very deep glacial valley between you and the next ridge. And then the next ridge is also like this very beautiful green grass, just plain experience kind of thing. And I feel like this was when we first started to realize how up close and personal you get with the glaciers on this trail. Because, you're kind of walking along this ridge and you've gotten used to walking along ridges on this trail. You've done that the last few days. But suddenly you look down and you go, hey, I think we're standing basically right near a glacier. We actually could look up and see the toe, which would be the terminal or the end point of the glacier, and all the little rocks that it has on top of it. And we could see how it had carved out this valley. There's a river flowing below, and there's this really cool area that's like the glacial tailplane where it had left behind all the rocks as it had receded. And so as we were heading up, we couldn't see the mountain at all, but we really knew that we wanted to.
And we couldn't see the mountain because all of a sudden it was socked in on this area, even though in the morning when we left camp, it was totally visible to us. It seems like sometimes there are just areas around the mountain, and we'll talk about another one we got to in a subsequent episode, where clouds must tend to just like to form and stick.
Yes. And so we decided that we would just sit there and have lunch, which was kind of funny. We all sat down and it was like playing, I don't know, dodgeball to try and miss all of the like little areas where animals had pooped. There'd be like all this marmot poop. And
was this our first marmot sighting of the trip, I think?
Yeah, I think it was.
There were several, I don't know, there were probably like 8 or 10 marmots that had been just kind of running around on the Emerald Ridge where we decided to have our lunch. So they're just such fun, cute animals. We enjoyed watching them. And then as Carrie said, we kind of had to investigate an area where you could even sit down without sitting in their droppings. And then we kind of just looked to the mountain to see if it would show us anything or not. But also, in the meantime, really just appreciating how we were basically, on the edge of a kind of on a cliff, and below us was an active glacier.
Yeah, and finally the clouds did lift. I felt like we were being too optimistic, and we stayed there for quite a while, but the clouds did start to lift, so we could actually, it was funny because I thought the mountain was going to be more to our left, and then it was like straight ahead of us. Yeah. So it's kind of like one of those slightly disorienting things, but we got to see the mountain kind of flit in and out of the clouds, and then finally we were satisfied with how much we'd gotten to see and take some photos, and we decided to start heading down because we did still have some miles to make that day.
Which in reality, that was such a scenic area. I would have loved to stay there for even longer, and we didn't have the time or the daylight to do that. But at the time, I wrote in my journal at the end of the day that was one of my favorite views on the trail so far, which this was day 3 for us, but it was an epic view.
And I love that because it was not even a full view, but it was still basically one of your favorites. Yeah. And then it was so cool because as you head down into this area where there clearly must have been a ton of like separate pieces of the glacier like flowing down the mountain there, because there are these things called like lateral moraines, which would be the moraines that are on the sides of a glacier. And you can kind of get good at identifying them the more that you're around mountains and have the opportunity to like identify land features. But you could see all these walls of glacial moraines that were like hundreds of feet high. And at first we were like, oh my goodness, are we gonna have to go up and down into every like glacial moraine? And fortunately it kind of followed obviously the path of least resistance. But it was so cool to see all these spots where the glaciers had, literally been shaping the land. And I feel like there's like this beautiful symmetry where you're walking and on one side of you is a glacier still flowing, still shaping the land, and no one's walking down there because it's like still active glaciers. And then you go to your right and you're walking in a place that was formed by the same like physical processes. So that was really neat.
And it was really cool because when we took our mountaineering course the year before, we had talked about like the glacial slabs, which are smooth rocks that have been polished essentially by a glacier. And then we had talked about, different characteristics of the rock beneath the glacier that might cause crevasses and ice falls. And so it was really cool to, on one hand, see a glacier where you can kind of see the moraines that it's formed and the glacial slabs, the smooth rock. And then on your other side, you can look at where a glacier once was and you can see a cliff and you're like, wow, this is probably an area where there was an ice fall. And here's an area where, the glacier was doing, this certain action. And it was really cool at Mount Rainier on the Wonderland Trail to feel like sometimes you're seeing the things that the glacier has left behind and having to imagine, but it almost took a lot of the imagination out of it because you're seeing it in action and then you're seeing what it's left behind, which was really, really cool. And I just felt so grateful too, because when we had been in Glacier National Park just a couple days prior, as we were driving out to Washington, we went on going to the Sun Road, and a ranger was up there on the pass with like a viewing scope so that people could look and see like the Jackson Glacier or something. And the glacier was like several miles away, so you're basically looking through like binoculars to be able to see the surface of the glacier. And here we were just like very close to it throughout our hike. And I was just like, wow, we don't have to use anything to look at it, to magnify it, because it's just right there in our face. So we started to descend from Emerald Ridge, and like Carrie said, we were able to just soak in so many different views of the different moraines that the glaciers had left behind in days gone by. And then at this point, the mountain was kind of not socked in anymore, so we kept kind of looking over our shoulder to just steal views of the mountain. And I just remember this area being really scenic and really just a diverse area just in terms of like geology. Like, it's not just like a dense forest. There's just like so much that had happened with the glaciers that had been there. So in reality, there are so many days and so many areas along the trail that are kind of favorites for me, but this area really was one of my favorite areas because it was so cool. And we descended, and it was a little tough to make good time just because it was a little bit more sandy, kind of rocky, but we were doing just fine. And we knew that we were going to descend, and that would be followed by our third ascent of the day. And then after that, even more descending. So there was a ways to go. And we kind of got to a more forested area. And it's interesting because after doing the Lewitt Loop around Mount St. Helens, there were these kind of characteristics of a forest that we got to as we were descending into valleys to cross glacial rivers, where it gets really mossy, and then there are these trees and the rocks are like this kind of a gray color. And it was weird because we descended into this area and it looked similar to what we had seen on Mount St. Helens. So that was kind of cool. And then I saw to my left this thing suspended across basically a valley with a raging river below it. And I said, what is that?
And I was like, that is the suspension bridge that we are going to cross. And it honestly reminded me of, I feel like, what's that movie? The Emperor's New Groove. I feel like there's a huge suspension bridge and it looks so insane in the movies. And you're like, that's animated. That's not real life. Suspension bridges do look that crazy in real life, I found out. So it was kind of intimidating to walk up to because it's 150 feet high and 200 feet long? 200 feet high and 150 feet long. So it's like you're way up and out there, and it's not like you just can trot across and you'll be done. You have a little bit of a ways to go.
And I kept saying, no way we're going across that. There is no way. And I remember, a couple of years prior, we did the cable car. And I feel like that wasn't even as intimidating as this suspension bridge. And historically, I've dealt with a fear of heights that has really subsided significantly with all the different hiking and mountaineering that I've done. And I knew I was going to cross the bridge, but for a moment I was like, oh my gosh, can I actually cross that?
Yeah, it was a little nerve-wracking. And I just was like, my best way to deal with it is I'm just going to go across it, like just get through it and go. And so I was the first one to cross, and we kind of just clipped our poles onto our backpack so we could use both of our hands on the suspension bridge. And one thing that's crazy is they are kind of bouncy, so you start going across it and it starts bouncing and it feels like you want to look behind and be like, Molly, get off the bridge. It says one person at a time, but you're the only one on it. And it's also funny because there were some missing boards in it, which I feel like every movie you ever see where someone's running across a suspension bridge, there's a missing board. And that's accurate. Yeah. Obviously, it's very well reinforced. I know that the Forest Service must take amazing care of it because otherwise they would definitely not keep it there. But it was just the craziest crossing. And I tried to just kind of, go across it efficiently. But I feel like I did pause a couple times to try and be like, wow, like taking this view a tiny bit, like the mountains over there, you're over this huge river, you're over this like glacially carved valley, and you could even see like how high the river gets sometimes just from like where boulders had been deposited and stuff. So it was really cool to look at, but it was also a little bit nerve-wracking. And then of course, after I go across, Rachel goes across hands-free.
For part of the way. But when I went across, when I would look down, it was pretty mind-boggling just how far down the ground was. And once again, I think it's about as safe of a suspension bridge as you can find. But when you get to the one part where like a slat is missing and you have to step over it, it was definitely an adventure and kind of a fun experience actually to just kind of add to the overall adventure of the trail.
Yeah. Which I had to tell myself logically, like, okay, well, if one slat's missing and your foot falls through it, like, I don't even think it's a big enough area for like the rest of your leg to even go that far. But there was a spot where there was 2 slats missing, and I was like, oh yeah, what about this, self? But anyway, we all made it across the suspension bridge safely, and then we were going to do our last climb of the day. So it's kind of like, okay, got to just buckle in and climb. And as we were climbing, we actually heard this like really intense crashing sound. We could hear rocks like crashing. And I mean, I feel like anytime I hear rockfall outdoors, I always like stop and try to look around and figure out, is it anywhere near enough to me that I need to move somewhere else? And fortunately, this was nowhere near enough. But as we got a little higher up, we did ask some people who were like, did you hear that rock fall? And they were like, yeah, we heard it. It was so crazy loud. So it's kind of interesting because we were near these like cliffs. So it must have just been some rock fall off of that.
Yeah. We settled in for another climb. And this side of the hill that we were climbing was actually pretty shaded at this time of the day, which was actually nice. And we were once again reminded how happy we were that we were out here in September and climbing in the shade and not having to deal with a heat wave. But yeah, we just kind of continued to motor up the hill. I remember there was one somewhat flat section that we walked along and we were like, wow, this is amazing. And then right back to uphill. And then once again, like all climbs do, it was over and we were at an area called Indian Henry's Hunting Ground, which you cannot camp in, to my knowledge, but there's actually like a ranger cabin up there, which is super scenic. So we really enjoyed our time up in that area just because the leaves had been turning red. So all the like huckleberry or blueberry bushes were red. The mountain was just clear as day. The sky was blue, and it just felt like I was in the middle of like a movie about fall in Mount Rainier National Park.
And truthfully, I feel like all of us agreed we were pretty sure we've seen that same image of the cabin that we saw and like fall colors and Mount Rainier in like a stock photo of Mount Rainier somewhere. So it was very much like stepping into a stock photo, which was honestly so cool. But we made really quick work of our time in the Indian Henry's hunting ground because it's mostly flat with just like some little uphill and a little bit of downhill. Although I will say like some of the most beautiful glacially carved like sort of little U-shaped valleys with reds and greens and oranges was right there. So it was a really cool area. Then it was time to descend, and we went near an area that's called Devil's Dream Campsite, and everyone says it's like the worst campsite ever in the summer because there's so many mosquitoes there. Of course, that was not something that was going to affect us at all, but it was kind of a funny campsite area because as I was walking down the trail, I was like, that's weird that that person is setting up their tent right on trail. And it was actually just that the tent sites were like right off the trail versus being a little bit farther back. We also laughed because we kind of rate campsites based on how close the toilet is to the tent sites. Like, do you have a long walk in the morning? Do you have to walk uphill or downhill in the morning? That is things that will give it a good or a bad rating for us. And these campsites all seem perfectly fine, but it seemed like such a bummer because if you want, like half the campsites were uphill from the toilet and half of them were downhill. So we said that this campsite truly was the devil's dream because no matter where you camped, you'd have to either go uphill on the way to the toilet or uphill on the way back. So it really was not good all the way around.
And we did, it really felt like we were descending into kind of just like deep forested terrain. And I don't know. I think Devil's Dream would actually be a perfectly fine place to camp. It looked like nice forest to me. And we continued descending, and then the trail was switchbacking. And every time we would turn to do our switchback, we were actually at the edge of this canyon. And so we kind of peered over the edge, and it was pretty deep, like probably 70 feet deep or so. And I think that maybe that's called the Devil's Dream Canyon, we think. And we just have to laugh because the stone in the canyon was kind of a basalt type of rock, like the type of rock that you see at Devil's Post Pile or Devil's Tower. And we just have to laugh because it's like whoever named it was like, this is like...
Well, so my whole story is that anytime they saw like basalt that they couldn't explain, they were like, that's from the devil. So it's like the Devil's Post Pile. They're like, that's a weird rock from the devil. Like, oh, here's a canyon. They're like, oh, weird rock. That must be the Devil's Canyon. So we just kind of laugh because it's all like titled off of that, even though it seemed perfectly fine.
But Devil's Dream was a catchphrase for us for a while as we continued hiking along.
And as we hiked along, it just kind of felt like the day was taking forever because it was like slightly longer than the last few days. But I feel like we just had some good times. We shared some snacks. Rachel had fruit roll-ups, which I haven't had in years, and it turns out they're amazing.
Yeah. And she did the tongue tattoo.
Yeah. So that made it extra fun. But eventually we made it to our campsite, and it was so crazy. There was no one else there. All the campsites at Devil's Dream were full, but no one was at Pyramid Creek. So we picked the campsite that we wanted, and 10 out of 10 campsite, because to get to the toilet, you do not have to walk uphill or downhill. You just walk to the toilet. So we kind of just made our dinner in the dark because we got there a little bit later, made sure all our tents were set up. And one thing that was negative about this campsite was as I was getting ready for bed, I did see a little mouse staring at me with its greedy eyes. So that's a little foreshadowing perhaps for you guys for next week. But all in all, great campsite because the toilet was right there.
And so I was doing the math for the next day because I think I was thinking it was like 16.6 miles. And then I was looking at it again, and it looked like it was going to be more like 17 something. But we also had to do a reroute, which I didn't know if I'd be able to factor in the mileage or not. Plus our first resupply of the trail at Longmire. So I remember we all kind of had a chat about when we wanted to start in the morning because we had upwards of 17 miles to go with, once again, daylight shrinking as we're getting to the end of September. So I remember thinking like, okay, we got to make sure that we're out of here by like 8 a.m., which is kind of a big ask when you're us and you don't like to leave camp early.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
See how we can do that normally now without just laughing and laughing? You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram if you want to see pictures or videos about what we talked about today, and we hope you'll join us next week.
Bye.